Good morning. Before the sermon, we'll be reading from Exodus chapter 19. If you want to turn there are blue Bibles under your seats, and in those blue Bibles is page 35. So that's Exodus 19, verse 16. A couple sections here. We'll do a little bit in chapter 20 as well. Verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. You'll skip down to chapter 20, verse 18. 20, verse 18. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off, and said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. This is the reading of the Lord.
Thanks, Andy. Well, good morning, church. My name's Trey. I am an elder candidate here at Cross and Crown. Great to be with you this morning. Glad we get to worship together. Today, we are continuing in our series that we've been in on the attributes of God, and we're going to be talking about two of God's attributes. God's transcendence, his distance from his creatures because of his holiness and his greatness, and God's immanence, his nearness and relationship to his creatures. In a sense, though next week Brad's going to be talking about the sovereignty and providence of God, this morning really kind of serves as a bridge between the two parts of God's attributes in our series that we're looking at, which is God's incommunicable attributes, those things that he alone holds and does not in any sense really share with us, and the communicable attributes of God, those attributes of God that he also in some way shares with his creation. As Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck notes, the reason theologians have taken such great lengths to address all of the attributes of God for centuries, millennia even, systematically from the scriptures, is to maintain this understanding of both God's transcendence and his immanence, his relationship to the creature. And I'm going to quote from this guy a lot. A.W. Tozer says that it's very difficult to think of God as transcendent and also immanent. It's difficult to understand how he can be here with us, in us, pervading all things, but at the same time, transcending all things. It looks like a contradiction. God is always nearer than you imagine him to be. God is so near that your thoughts are not as near as God. Your breath is not as near as God. Your very soul is not as near to you as God is. And yet, because he is God, his uncreated being is so far above us that no thought can conceive it, nor words express it. Holding these two truths together, much less in the same sermon, feels paradoxical. They seem like contradictions, but what I want to show you this morning is that they aren't. And so I want us to consider first this morning the story from the passage that Andy just read to us. Setting the scene for this, the people of God have been brought out of slavery in Egypt, and they've crossed over the Red Sea. They are now camped around the foot of Mount Sinai. And it's here at Mount Sinai that God is making his covenant with his people. He wants a people who are holy and consecrated to him. And he tells them that they are going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation before him. And they say, great, we love it, we're all in. And so God then tells Moses, hey, I'm going to come down so that my people can hear me speak to them. I'm going to descend as in a thick cloud, because God's glory is so great that if people were to even see a glimpse of it, they would die. But it's more than that. Moses is instructed to tell the people not to even come near to the mountain. He's to actually cordon it off. Pull out the police tape and keep them away. Like, set up the fences and the barricades, because they cannot get close to the mountain and touch it. If they are to touch it, then they shall die. He actually says, if anyone approaches the mountain when I descend on it, they are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Even the people who are supposed to execute God's judgment on the disobedient people, if there are any, are not even supposed to touch the people who broke God's commandment. And Moses is to instruct the people to prepare their bodies and their hearts through washing their bodies and their clothes and consecrating their hearts to God. And so God shows up 3 days later, and the people are not to come near. They're not allowed to touch the mountain or enter the cloud. And if anyone does, they will be put to death. And so when God comes down, Moses goes up to meet him. And he tells Moses, hey, listen, I want you to go back to the people. Make sure the people know that I'm serious. They are not supposed to touch it. And Moses is like, yeah, I think they got it. Like, when you said they were going to be shot with arrows if they came and touched the mountain, I think they got it. But he goes and he tells them again. And then we get to the verses that Andy read, and God speaks to his people from the cloud. And as he speaks to his people, this is where he delivers the 10 Commandments. The first part of chapter 20 is the 10 Commandments being given to the people of God. And after God speaks the basis of the law to his people, establishing his covenant with them, in verse 18 we read, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to God for us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. But then still, we read that the people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Do you see the paradox at play in this passage? God, transcendent, holy, omnipotent, nevertheless comes down to where his people are. He condescends. He is with them, displaying for them to see what is already true. He is near. And this nearness of God that they can see and hear, and were they to be disobedient, could touch, it terrifies them. Like Isaiah, when he's given the vision of God on his throne in the temple, the people of God are undone. Philip Ryken points out that when God's people see him as transcendent, they approach him with awe and wonder, if they approach him at all. And when they see him as immanent, they approach him conscious of the fact that he is near to them with confidence, knowing that he is with them. But he goes on to note, I think, something really important, that though both of these are true about God, he says the trouble is that the church usually tends to emphasize one at the expense of the other. Which leads me to the contrast that I want us to see this morning between how God's people responded to his tangible immanence in Exodus 19 and how we today, thankfully not here at Cross and Crown, but in the church at large today, tend to approach God with a kind of flippancy. We live in what Ryken calls an age of immanence, where we're so comfortable with our personal friend, pocket-sized God, that we forget his transcendence. We forget that he is other than us. That's the only thing in my mind that can account for why so many churches are filled with an artificial thick cloud and smoke. Flashing LEDs and Hollywood-level stage design in the lobby. Like, I've seen and participated in some things over the course of my life in the church that just doesn't make me cringe. It makes me gasp at its flippancy. And that's important to note. We are not to be flippant when we come into the presence of God. From the moment the call to worship begins, we are meant to recognize that we are in the presence of the Lord. So this morning, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to read several passages that show us God's transcendence. And as we do, I want to point out two things. That one, God's transcendence should fill us with awe. We should be filled with wonder at the transcendent nature of God. And his transcendence should also fill us with dread. Then, we're going to look at the immanence of God. We're going to read several passages that show God's immanence, particularly in the person of Christ. And as we do, I want you to notice two things there as well. God's immanence should fill us with comfort, and it should infuse us with a confident hope. And so, let's begin by looking at how God is transcendent. Earlier, when I introduced what we were talking about this morning, I said that God's transcendence is his distance from his creatures because of his holiness and greatness. And then in the quote from Tozer, we saw that God is so far above us that no thought can conceive it, nor words express it. And what Tozer does immediately after making that statement is offer a qualification that I think is really helpful. It says, when we say that God is far above, we don't mean geographically or astronomically. We're not talking in space-time when we talk about God's being far aboveness from us. Brad talked about this in the last few weeks as we looked at God's eternity, but God exists outside the bounds of time. He's not contained in this timeline that we are in. He is outside of it. But he also exists outside the confines of the spatial material world. He's not confined to the material world as if that is all that there is. The reason this is so important to make note of is as we use analogies for God and his attributes, those analogies are informed by the way that we already see and perceive the world. And so there's this natural inclination that we have in prayer, in worship, to look up, right? To direct our eyes upward as if that is the only place or the primary place where God is. Which isn't wrong in the sense that you shouldn't fix your eyes on the heavens as you pray to the Lord. It's simply important to note, as Tozer does, that God never thinks about the size of anything. Because God contains everything. He never thinks about distance because he is everywhere. He doesn't have to go from one place to another. We humans use these expressions to help us think. They're analogies and illustrations. Understanding this has always been important. Because even though we live in a materialist age, where everything that is just matter in motion, even in pagan ages of the past, the gods that they worshiped lacked this quality. I don't know if you remember Jonah's speech to the sailors on the boat before they threw him over to quiet the storm. But he gets woken up. They cast lots to see who's at fault for the storm coming upon them, threatening everyone's lives. It falls on Jonah, and he gets interrogated. Like, who are you? Where are you from? What God do you worship? Like, why is this happening? And he responds, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. See, the pagan way of seeing the world has gods over everything, from rain to crops to the sea. But these gods are tied to their place and their thing. They're confined to their geographic region and their material dominion. And Jonah says this to these men, and the men are exceedingly afraid, the text tells us. Because the God that Jonah serves and worship is not just a God over some specific part of the world. He is the God who created and rules over the sea and the dry land. Or in other words, he's the God who rules everything. He's transcendent. And as Jonah quickly finds out, there is nowhere to run from God. What Tozer points out as he makes his point about God not being confined to special understandings of the material world is that it's not things like distance that matter when we think about God. It's quality of being that is important. God is just as far above, Tozer says, an archangel as he is a caterpillar. Now think about that contrast. Why? Because both the archangel and the caterpillar are creatures. And God is the uncreated one who had no beginning, the self-existent one who was never created, but who was simply God, who made all things. There is a vast gulf fixed between that which is God and that which is not God. And so we see again and again in the Scriptures this qualitative difference between God and his creation. We see that God's transcendence is on display in his greatness and majesty. As the creator of everyone and everything, he is wholly and completely unlike all other things and beings in the cosmos. And so just consider, for example, Exodus 15:11. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? Or Psalm 86, 8 through 10. There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any words like yours. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God. Or Psalm 145:3. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. However, his transcendence is more than his immensity, but also that he is unable to be known in his totality by any created thing. And so, consider again what Job says in Job 11, his friend says to him in Job 11, 7 through 9. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? It is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. Or Job 26:14. Behold, these are but the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? Or Psalm 89, 5 through 7. Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord, a God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him? But this transcendence of God goes deeper still. I've quoted a lot from Tozer already, but one of the most famous quotes that you've probably heard that Tozer said was, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us," which is true, but only so far. Hear how God speaks in Isaiah 55. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Yes, the most important thing about us might be what we think when we think about God, but even if we are doing that to the best of our ability, it still cannot compare to God, who transcendently, his ways and his thoughts are higher than ours. What comes into our mind is not anywhere close to describing who he is. So I think from these scriptures, we have a pretty good picture of how God is transcendent. And so the important question to ask is, why does God's transcendence matter for you and I this morning? And it comes down to the two things that I mentioned earlier. That God is transcendent should fill us with awe and wonder, but also a sense of dread. And maybe that strikes you as odd, particularly the dread piece. Awe and wonder, sure. But why dread? Why simultaneously? And really, the best way that I can illustrate this is to give you an example from a trip that I took to the Canadian Rockies last summer. One afternoon while we were there, I decided I was going to go climb to the top of a mountain that I had been staring at from the porch of our Airbnb since the day we arrived. The summit was just shy of 8,000 feet, and the ascent was breathtaking the entire way up. It was a 2,400-foot climb of sheer wonder and a whole lot of heavy breathing, because clearly I am not made for hiking. And that feeling of awe and wonder never went away from the moment I started up until I got back to the bottom. But as I made my way above the tree line, and it started to become apparent that though this was a very well-traveled path that thousands of people had been up probably that month, I was doing something that was still really dangerous. The last 200 feet to the summit was far less defined than everything else that I had traveled up, and I was wearing some really bad shoes. One wrong move could have legitimately resulted in great injury or death. And when I reached the top, I was blown away by what I could see. The mountain range stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. The trees, 50, 60 feet tall in themselves, looked like blades of grass from the peak. But right under my feet was the edge of the mountain. And the face of the mountain was not a gentle slope up and down on all sides. At its summit, the way down on the front face of the mountain was a sheer drop thousands of feet to the base. And I was the most terrified that I have ever been in my entire life in that moment. Winds blowing 40, 50 miles an hour. I'm already scared of heights. But I also realized that a simple mistake right there on the edge of this mountain, a mistake that goes unnoticed if I'm standing on the ground, tripping over my two left feet, is not a problem here. It is a problem there. And so I literally could not bring myself to stand at the edge. I sat. I drank some water. I called my family because I had cell service finally. Said, hey, I made it to the top. And then I carefully made my way back down. That is the feeling that the I Am, the transcendent God, maker of heaven and earth, the maker of that very mountain that I was on, who is so far above us that no thought can conceive it, nor word express it. That is how we should feel when we enter into his presence each week. It should fill us with awe and wonder and terrify us to our bones. That's the feeling that the people of God in Exodus 19 had. As the thick smoke and the peals of thunder and the flashes of lightning descended on Mount Sinai, they were in awe, but they recognized the nature of the God who was coming to them. When we understand who God is, his presence should, in a very real sense, amaze and terrify us. When we come into this place each week, we are entering into more than a gym or a sanctuary. We are entering into a space where the presence and glory of God chooses to dwell. And we know from the scriptures that where 2 or 3 of his people gather in his name, he is there with us. Which means he is here now. How often, though, do we come into the presence of God with a kind of flippancy? Earlier, I threw some of the wacky things that happen in evangelicalism under the bus. Happy to do that. But think about your own attitude coming into this place each week. Like, do you come in and through those curtains with your mind set on the reality that you will be standing at the edge of the mountain of God? Does your heart and your mouth and your eyes and your fingertips on your phone reflect that wonder and dread? When the call of worship begins, are you attuned to what is happening in that moment? That you're not just being given some pretty psalms to ponder, but you are being called into the throne room of this God we have described this morning. As we sing songs of praise and adoration, are you fixated on the words you are singing to your Maker? Or distracted by your neighbor's tune or lack thereof? What is happening after you leave? Or any number of other things. Is the phone in your hand as the word is being proclaimed? Is it helping you engage? Because that's where God's word is set before your eyes. Or is it a distraction feeding your dopamine receptors that are already hijacked this morning? Like, it is so easy to lose sight of the weight of entering into the throne room of grace each week. And yet we should fight and strive to be awestruck and terrified by this holy and great God that we serve. Now, with God's transcendence in view, we need to turn to the second thing that we need to see this morning, and that is that God is also immanent. In the late 17th and into the early 19th centuries, the West was in what was known as the Age of Enlightenment. And much of the way that we think of and conceive the world in the modern West is a byproduct of the Enlightenment notions of philosophy and metaphysics and psychology and so forth and so on. And one of the ideas that became exceedingly popular among many in this time period, including not a few of the founding fathers, was the idea of deism. And deism basically posits that, yes, God exists, but like a divine clockmaker, he's created the world, and he simply lets it continue to operate on its own, free from his intervention. For the deist, God exists as transcendent, but not as immanent. To say that God is immanent is to say that he remains in creation, not only above it. So Tozer puts it this way: God is omnipresent, which means God is everywhere. But God is also immanent, which means that God penetrates everything. even while he contains all things. And he uses this illustration, which is odd, but I think also like the most helpful visual for what God's immanent means. It's like a bucket sunk into the depths of the ocean. The bucket that is sunk into the depths of the ocean is full of the ocean. The ocean is in the bucket. But also the bucket is in the ocean and surrounded by it. Herman Bavinck describes God's immanence as his community with and his indwelling in the world. For Bavinck, the insistence on the first group of God's attributes, his transcendence, his incommunicable attributes, that it saves us from errors like polytheism and pantheism. And it's the insistence on the second group, his immanence and the attributes that are communicable to us, that protect us against deism and atheism. So returning to the story of Israel and Mount Sinai, we see that the transcendent God puts his immanence, that was already true because God is immanent, whether we see him or recognize it or not, he puts it on display as he comes down onto the mountain. That's not the only time in the Exodus story that we actually see God tangibly at work in the world and in the workings of man. When God calls Moses through the burning bush, it's a picture of God's immanence. He says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land. That's not a God who's far removed, not intervening in the human affairs that are taking place because he's just set the world and left it. I mean, he's talking to Moses through a burning bush for one. But then also he says, I've heard the cry of my people. I see their distress, and I have come to make it right. And as God goes about delivering his people, he sends plagues that require his active work in the created world and in the heart of Pharaoh, hardening Pharaoh's heart to show forth his glory. Then in their desperate flight from Pharaoh and his army, God parts the sea to allow them to pass on dry ground. And then as the song they sing after they make it to the other side says, he throws the horse and rider of Pharaoh's army into the sea. As they travel through the wilderness for 40 years, they're guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night. When they're thirsty, God provides water. Hungry, manna and quail. On and on, we could see that God is working in the world just in the story in Exodus. But it's not just that God does supernatural things that upend the natural order and things of that nature. In Daniel 4, we get an amazing declaration that God is intimately involved, not just in the hearts of men and the lives of his people, but all the kingdoms of the world. As Nebuchadnezzar has set himself up as a false deity, God terrorizes him in a dream. And he calls on Daniel to come and interpret it. And Daniel says to him at the end of the interpretation, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom is departed from you. It shall be given to, has departed from you. And you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beast of the field. And you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will. But it's not just in the affairs of the world or the supernatural suspensions of the created order that God works. As Tozer says, God penetrates everything. And so we have Paul in Athens before the altar of the unknown God in Acts 17. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything. He's transcendent. Since he himself gives life to all mankind and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet, he is not actually far from each one of us. Notice that God's transcendence moves to his immanence in Paul's speech. He himself gives us our life and breath and everything. And as Paul says in Colossians, that in Christ, God in the flesh, all things hold together. God's immanence is the very thing that keeps all creation from busting apart at the seams. Again, notice how, as he reasons with the Athenian philosophers, that God is actually not far from each one of us. What does that mean? Well, he means that God is, as I quoted from Tozer earlier, nearer than you imagine him to be. God is so near that your thoughts are not as near as God. Your breath is not as near as God. Your very soul is not as near to you as God is. Now, there is no greater picture of God's immanence than the one painted in John chapter 1. The Gospel of John begins with these words: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men." This is a picture of the transcendent God. Remember, is God's distance from his creation by nature his being that transcendence is describing? Yet look at verse 14 of John 1. "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." God is so very immanent that he not only works in the world, but he entered into it. He himself came into the world as each and every one of us has. He took on flesh and dwelt among us. All the glory and majesty on display at Sinai, all the power that made the world and everything in it was contained in the person of Jesus Christ in human form. The God who made and sustains the entire universe felt the sand between his toes, sweat on his brow, calluses on his hands, and the rumbling in his stomach when he needed to eat. He felt the throbbing pain of fist against his face before the religious leaders, the sting of the whips on his exposed flesh from the Roman soldiers, and the suffocating pain of his own weight crushing him on the cross. Though Christ, resurrected and glorified, has ascended into heaven, where he's seated at the right hand of God, no longer bodily is in the world, God is still as immanent in the world today as he was when he dwelt on the earth as Jesus Christ, the Son on the earth. God is still immanent, so much so that for the believer, the very Spirit of God dwells in you. Jesus tells the disciples that it's to our advantage that he goes away, that he is now seated at the right hand of the Father. "For if I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you." And so why does the immanence of God matter to you this morning? Because God is nearer to you right now than your own thoughts. And that should fill you with comfort and instill you with a confident hope. Maybe you're here and plagued by the things in your own mind. Maybe you're caught in a cycle of despair, painfully aware of your shortcomings and failures. You should be filled with comfort today. God is near to you. Yes, even you. Listen to what David says in Psalm 34. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears toward their cry. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Well, Trey, that says his eyes are toward the righteous, that he rescues the righteous. So doesn't that mean that the brokenhearted and crushed in spirit that he is near and saves are just the righteous ones? Well, friend, let me ask you, who is righteous, and how does one become one of the righteous? It's those who have their faith and trust in Jesus Christ, the only truly righteous one who for our sake became sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Are you in Christ, but brokenhearted and crushed in spirit? He is near to you now as he has ever been. And that nearness should fill you not just with comfort, but it should give you a confident hope this morning. Listen to Psalm 139. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely darkness shall cover me, and light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as day, for darkness is as light to you. There is nowhere in all creation that you can go that God is not. He is far above all that we can ever think or imagine. But he is nearer to you than you could ever dare to hope. Stand in awe and dread of his greatness and his majesty, while simultaneously being comforted and full of hope at his presence here with you even now. Friends, let's rejoice in what God has done in revealing himself to us. Though he be far above all that we could ever think or imagine, he is closer to us today than we could ever dream. Let's pray this morning.